There's a very specific figure narcissists learn to fear, though they'd never use that word to describe it, one they can typically sense within moments of encountering her, long before she's said or done anything overtly threatening at all. This is the super empath, not simply someone kind, not simply someone sensitive, but someone whose entire psychology has become the one thing narcissistic strategy has genuinely no answer for. Today, we're going to trace exactly what makes the super empath uniquely, specifically the narcissist's worst enemy, drawing together everything we've explored throughout this entire series into its clearest, most complete picture yet. Let's start with something crucial to understand about why enemy is actually the right word here, despite how much this entire series has emphasized that super empaths never set out to defeat or destroy anyone. Remember everything we discussed in our conversation about how betraying a super empath destroys a narcissist forever, and in our conversation about emotional awakening producing something more dangerous than narcissism itself. The super empath doesn't become his enemy through deliberate opposition. She becomes his enemy simply by existing in a form his entire operational strategy has no framework for successfully processing. Here's the first reason this specific figure represents such uniquely severe opposition. Remember everything we've traced about narcissistic strategy depending on exploiting genuine emotional depth, finding partners capable of real feeling, real compassion, real vulnerability, and then systematically extracting from that capacity without ever reciprocating it. A super empath possesses exactly this depth, which means she initially, briefly, appears to a narcissist exactly like ideal prey, someone with abundant emotional resources ripe for extraction. This is precisely what makes her eventual transformation into his worst enemy so genuinely devastating, rather than simply inconvenient. He doesn't encounter someone who is always immune to his tactics, someone whose guardedness he could identify and avoid from the beginning. He encounters someone who initially genuinely fit his profile perfectly, invested real trust, real vulnerability, real hope in the relationship, and then, through exactly the painful process we've traced throughout this entire series, transformed that same depth of feeling into something his tactics genuinely cannot penetrate anymore. Here's the second reason, one we examined extensively in our conversation about why narcissists are drawn to empaths in the first place. Remember the mechanism. He's not simply attracted to kindness in the abstract. He's specifically drawn to genuine emotional depth because his own psychology lacks the capacity to generate this depth internally, which means he needs to access it externally through exactly the kind of person capable of providing it. This means a super empath represents something his psychology genuinely craves and genuinely needs, which makes her eventual, complete unavailability considerably more devastating than losing access to someone whose depth he never actually valued or required in the first place. Here's the third reason, one connecting directly to our earlier conversation about narrative control. Remember how thoroughly narcissistic stability depends on managing what other people believe, positioning himself favorably regardless of what actually occurred. A super empath's perception, developed through exactly the kind of painful, thorough healing we've traced throughout this entire series, cannot be successfully argued against or reframed, precisely because it was built through direct, accurate observation rather than confusion he could exploit. This makes her uniquely dangerous to his narrative management in a way that distinguishes her from partners whose perception remains genuinely uncertain or easily influenced. Here's the fourth reason, connecting to our conversation about attention versus love. Remember that his psychology needs continuous engagement, whether positive or negative, in order to feel significant and real. A super empath, having done the work we've traced throughout this entire series, genuinely stops providing this engagement, not through deliberate withholding, but through authentic, complete indifference that offers his psychology genuinely nothing to work with. This absence of exploitable engagement removes the entire mechanism his strategy depends on, leaving him facing someone whose continued existence genuinely doesn't require his relevance, in order to feel complete. Part 2. Let's trace exactly what happens once a narcissist actually encounters this specific opposition in real time, because watching his usual toolkit fail, one tactic at a time, reveals something crucial about why the super empath proves so uniquely resistant to strategies that have reliably worked on almost everyone else throughout his life. Here's what typically happens first, and it connects directly to something we discussed extensively in our conversation about narcissists silent around super empaths. Rather than immediately deploying his usual charm offensive with full confidence, something in his instinctive pattern recognition system registers a discrepancy almost immediately, often within the first substantial interaction. Remember what we traced about how narcissists depend on reading emotional cues, gauging exploitability through subtle signals most people never consciously send or receive. A super empath, even in early encounters, transmits something his instinct struggles to categorize: warmth, without the anxious eagerness to please that typically signals easy exploitability, genuine attentiveness without the desperate hunger for approval that usually indicates someone whose validation seeking can be reliably weaponized. This initial discrepancy often produces one of two responses, and understanding both matters for recognizing what you might witness if you're watching this dynamic unfold. Some narcissists respond with immediate, unconscious caution, quietly redirecting their energy towards someone whose signals feel more familiar and more workable, essentially self-selecting away from the super empath before any real relationship ever develops. This explains a pattern many super empaths report confusingly. Narcissists in social or professional settings who seem to actively avoid deeper engagement with them, gravitating instead toward colleagues or acquaintances whose reactivity remains more readable and more exploitable. Other narcissists, though, particularly those confident in tactics that have worked reliably across many previous relationships, proceed anyway, assuming their usual approach will eventually succeed the way it always has before. This is where the real confrontation begins, and it's worth tracing in detail, because watching each tactic fail, one after another, reveals exactly why this specific opposition proves so comprehensively effective. The idealization phase typically proceeds relatively normally at first, because a super empath's genuine warmth and capacity for connection means she often does respond with real interest and real engagement during these early stages, precisely because nothing yet has revealed the pattern underneath the performance. This is worth understanding clearly. Her eventual resistance isn't cynical suspicion applied indiscriminately from the very first meeting. It's discernment that activates specifically once genuine evidence accumulates, which means the idealization phase often unfolds with genuine warmth on her part before anything shifts. Here's where things begin diverging from his usual pattern, though, often earlier than he's accustomed to. Remember what we discussed about her capacity for pattern recognition developed through painful previous experience. Small inconsistencies that most partners might miss or explain away, a story that shifts slightly in retelling, a kindness that seems calculated rather than spontaneous, a subtle discomfort when she demonstrates independence he hasn't specifically approved, register with her considerably faster than they would with someone whose discernment hasn't been sharpened through exactly the kind of experience we've traced throughout this entire series. This is where his first tactic typically fails. The assumption that continued charm and continued idealization will smooth over whatever small inconsistencies she's noticed, the same way it's worked with previous partners whose desire to believe in the relationship outweighed their growing unease. With a super empath, this assumption proves increasingly unreliable because her desire for connection, however genuine, has already been paired with the discernment we discussed, which means charm alone increasingly fails to override what she's actually observing. When idealization fails to fully secure her continued investment despite these growing inconsistencies, his psychology typically shifts toward more active tactics: the subtle testing of boundaries, the small provocations designed to gauge how much she'll tolerate before pushing back. This is where the second major failure occurs, one we traced extensively in our conversation about how a super empath challenges a narcissist. Rather than the emotional reactivity these provocations are designed to produce, he encounters calm, factual observation instead, statements that reveal she's noticed the behavior without providing the emotional material his tactics depend on for successful escalation. Here's what makes this failure particularly significant rather than simply frustrating for him. Remember what we discussed about how his defensive system requires emotional material to work with, anger to redirect, tears to exploit, confusion to deepen. A super empath's calm observation offers none of this. There's no emotional intensity to reframe as her instability, no visible reaction to work with at all, simply factual acknowledgement that leaves him with nothing his usual counter-strategies know how to address. If provocation testing fails to produce reactivity, his psychology typically escalates toward more direct manipulation, the manufactured crises, the guilt-inducing narratives, the subtle attempts to isolate her from outside perspective that we discussed extensively throughout this series. Here's where the third significant failure occurs, and it's worth understanding precisely why it fails so consistently against this specific type of empath. Remember what we traced about her developed capacity to recognize incongruence, the gap between performance and authenticity that most people never learn to detect with this level of precision. Manufactured crises, however skillfully constructed, typically carry subtle inconsistencies that her particular sensitivity catches almost immediately, robbing the manipulation of the confused uncertainty it depends on to succeed. This accumulating pattern of failure, idealization unable to override her discernment, provocation unable to produce exploitable reactivity, manipulation unable to sustain its necessary illusion of authenticity, eventually produces exactly the crisis we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations in this series. Genuine confusion, genuine disorientation, the beginning of a psychological unraveling. His usual toolkit has no framework for successfully resolving. And this is where his behavior typically shifts from strategic manipulation towards something considerably more desperate, revealing something crucial about what happens once every conventional tool has been tried and found genuinely ineffective against this specific, uniquely formidable opposition. Because here's what typically happens once every conventional tool has genuinely failed, and understanding this final phase reveals why the super empath doesn't just resist his tactics. She ultimately dismantles the entire foundation his psychological survival depends on. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss, the collapse of regulatory outsourcing, narrative infrastructure, and predictive competence, all occurring roughly simultaneously once denial can no longer be sustained. With a super empath specifically, this collapse tends to arrive faster and more completely than it does following the loss of almost any other kind of partner, precisely because her particular combination of qualities dismantles all three supporting structures at once, rather than allowing him to retreat into whichever one remains partially intact. Here's what makes this final phase distinctly different from what typically follows losing an ordinary partner. Remember what we discussed about supply diversification, the way narcissistic psychology usually seeks rapid replacement to manage genuine crisis. This strategy typically works reasonably well, at least temporarily, because most sources of validation are functionally interchangeable enough that a new source can provide adequate, if imperfect, substitution. A super empath's specific quality of presence, the depth without exploitability, the warmth without weaponizable neediness, the perception that cannot be successfully argued against, genuinely cannot be quickly replicated by whoever comes next, regardless of how enthusiastically that next person initially offers admiration and engagement. This is precisely why losing a super empath specifically tends to produce the more severe, more lasting psychological consequences we traced throughout our conversation about betraying this specific type of empath permanently. The comparison anxiety we discussed, the selective memory intrusion, the persistent, unresolved sense that something significant has been lost without adequate replacement available. All of this occurs with particular intensity following this specific kind of loss, precisely because ordinary replacement strategies prove genuinely inadequate against what he's actually lost access to. Here's the fifth reason worth adding to everything we traced in our first conversation about why the super empath becomes his worst enemy, one that only becomes fully visible once you trace the entire arc we've covered across these three parts. She doesn't simply resist his tactics during the relationship itself. She permanently alters his relationship with every subsequent attempt to secure supply from anyone else. Remember what we discussed about the persistent bond avoidant men struggle to escape following relationships with this specific type of empath, though the mechanism operates somewhat differently here. Having encountered someone whose perception he genuinely couldn't manipulate, whose depth he genuinely couldn't successfully exploit, whose calm he genuinely couldn't destabilize, he often carries forward an unconscious, unresolved awareness that his usual tools contain limitations he'd never previously had to confront. Awareness that can quietly, persistently undermine his confidence in subsequent relationships, regardless of whether he ever consciously connects this uncertainty back to what happened with her specifically. This is worth understanding as the deepest, most lasting reason she genuinely functions as his worst enemy. Not simply that she successfully resisted him during their specific relationship, but that she permanently, irreversibly disrupted the confident certainty his psychological survival depends on maintaining across every relationship that follows. Here's what all of this ultimately needs to mean for you if you recognize yourself as this specific type of empath, or if you're currently in the process of becoming her through exactly the healing work we've traced throughout this entire series. Everything we've discussed today describes what happens to him, and understanding it can be genuinely validating, genuine confirmation that your own hard-won transformation produces real, measurable effects against exactly the kind of psychology that once sought to exploit you. But remember something we've returned to throughout this entire series in different forms. None of this transformation was actually built to defeat him. It was built for you, for your own genuine wholeness, your own genuine freedom, your own genuine capacity to move through the world fully feeling and fully protected simultaneously. The fact that this same transformation happens to render you his worst enemy is simply what wholeness looks like from the perspective of something that could only ever survive by consuming exactly what you used to give away freely before you finally completely learned you were never required to keep giving it at all. You didn't become his enemy by trying to become dangerous. You became his enemy by finally, completely becoming yourself.